Messaging impacts onboarding, it impacts retention, and it impacts the product development even. Because strong messaging aligns with the product experience, particularly through that adoption and activation process. Messaging is what helps you define why your product matters to your customers. It also controls the perception and creates an emotional connection with your customers all along your customer's experience.
Welcome to the Forget the Funnel podcast, where we help SaaS and recurring revenue businesses stop guessing and start making more customer-led and data-backed decisions about how to grow. We're a product marketing and growth consultancy that helps teams learn from their best customers, map and measure their experiences to unlock your most effective levers for growth. If you're ready to evolve past best practices and other people's playbooks, because you know that what got you here won't get you there, then this show is for you. With that, let's dive into the episode.
Hey everyone. So a lot of teams struggle with messaging, and I wager that there's a couple of reasons for that, but one of the primary reasons that we see that teams are struggling with messaging is because, and they're kind of panicking over it, is because just how crowded markets are these days. I mean, I feel like a broken record. It has never been harder to stand out in the market today. More and more markets are saturated and commoditized. And when that is the case for you, messaging is your moat. Really deeply understanding your customers and reflecting that understanding and being really strategic in your messaging is what can really create a moat for you. And I want to talk about that in this episode today, because I know that a lot of teams are really struggling with how competitive the landscape is right now. And I am convinced and really confident that if you can nail your messaging, it won't actually matter. And you will have a way better chance of standing out and still winning customers like you did before. Again, context here being that, like, you are not alone. So many teams are reaching out to us with this challenge. This is definitely a topic, like commoditized markets are definitely a topic that we've talked about before, but we've never done an episode where we talked specifically about how to leverage messaging and really create a moat for yourself. Why a lot of teams feel like their messaging is off is that actually it's their positioning that's off. So I thought this would be a good follow-on to that, to really sort of illustrate how not only positioning is needed for messaging, but also once you have that like high level messaging, how do you actually create and bring that to life and create assets around that that are going to really help you like win business, drive more revenue, grow. I mean, I don't even like to use these terms anymore because they're so overdone and over the top. But again, I want to focus on what you can do and what are the specifics of sort of taking this messaging to market. So going back to this, like why messaging matters more now than ever before. This is not going to surprise anybody. There's this classic, like the MarTech landscape that Scott Brinker, came up with years and years ago. And he's been tracking just the marketing technology landscape for years. I think he started doing it in like 2010. I don't remember, but the marketing technology landscape between the year it started, which I'm failing to remember the year now, and like last year was over 7,000% growth. And this problem is now being exacerbated. So if you thought your competition was tough in 2022 and 2023 and 2024, just you wait, because SaaS is actually expected to double in 2025, going from approximately 30,000 SaaS companies in 2024 to about 72,000 companies in 2025. So it is just going to get harder. And part of the reason for this is AI, obviously. Like that's the elephant in the room here. It's never been easier to launch AI-powered features, let alone products. Like bringing whole products to market is now, like the barrier to entry on that is just so much lower. So a lot more of us are going to find ourselves in really commoditized markets. And if you're relying on just like the joke now is like, just slap the word AI on your homepage. That is not a messaging strategy. That is not messaging. That is already actually deterring customers. Using the term AI without qualifying why AI is even part of your like product suite is almost turning customers off at this point. And I imagine there are some markets more so than others, particularly in MarTech, and probably with dev tools as well, where if you use the term AI, major red flags go off. So that is not a messaging strategy. That is not going to save you. True differentiation comes from how well you communicate your value, obviously, but there's a lot more to it. So again, I want to talk about how messaging as a moat, and this idea that messaging is what helps you define why your product matters to your customers. It also controls the perception and creates an emotional connection with your customers all along your customer's experience. And it leaves nothing to chance. Okay. So messaging as a moat leaves nothing to chance. And I really kind of want to double click on that, because the strategy that I'm talking about in this episode is really about crossing all your T's and dotting all of your I's when it comes to your messaging, and not leaving anything to chance, and not leaving any room for there to be any confusion about the value that you provide to customers, or leaving any gaps in when they feel supported or when they might need sort of reinforcement. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I need, but what I think is probably, maybe what will resonate with some of you is that if you do these things, if you do the recommendations that I am, and roll out the recommendations that I'm making in this episode, I wager you are going to be ahead of 95% of your competition. And the reason that I can say that is because I talk to, and by the way, actually, not only do I talk to them, I also see behind the curtain at a lot of these SaaS companies. And I will tell you that none of them are doing this. None. So good messaging takes your positioning and makes it sing in all kinds of contexts. So I want to give you just two really great examples of companies that have done this well. So positioning, their high level sort of way you might describe Gong, for example, would be revenue intelligence software. And they may describe themselves in that way in certain contexts, but how they make that sing is when they describe Gong like ditch the guesswork and close more deals. I think that's a really great example. And what that tells me is that they know they did the work and had the conversations with customers enough to know that guesswork was at the heart of what was leading people to seek out a solution like Gong. And then also the outcome that they're looking for is closing more deals. So again, from revenue intelligence software to ditch the guesswork, close more deals, big difference there. Another great example that I think is actually even better is Notion. So all-in-one workspace, I'm sure we've all seen websites where all-in-one workspace is the title on the page. But what Notion does with this all-in-one workspace is turns it into the messaging of the missing half of your brain, or something to that effect. And so you can see the difference between these two, all-in-one workspace and the missing half of your brain. That is basically positioning that is singing inside of really high quality messaging. So that's a little microcosm example of what I'm describing when I say that you need positioning as the foundation, and the sort of fundamental understanding of your positioning is what puts you in a position to be able to come up with messaging that is really, really going to land. Because again, the missing half of your brain, that says a lot. To me, that means they must have had conversations with their customers that might be a straight up quote from a conversation they had with their customers. I would actually be really, really curious. So that's the kind of messaging and really crisp encapsulation of your positioning that you should be capable of when you go through this process and when you take this process seriously. The other thing that I want to call out here is that anybody who is maybe in a product management role, or for the product folks that are listening to this episode, I would really caution you to against equating messaging with marketing. Messaging is not a marketing problem. By the way, I don't assume that many of you are, but there may be a couple of product folks here that are cool, marketing's got to fix our messaging. And actually, it's going to sound pretty obvious, and maybe is obvious, hopefully is obvious to many of you. Messaging impacts onboarding, it impacts retention, and it impacts the product development even, right? Because strong messaging aligns with the product experience, particularly through that adoption and activation process. It also obviously, and I'm going to get into this a little bit in a bit, your messaging is also obviously the articulation of how your product provides value, and you need to know how what customers say matters to them maps to the specific parts of the product that delivers that value. That is a product exercise. That is not a marketing exercise. So that's really important. But then the other thing is that when you think about the product adoption and product onboarding process, what you say really, really matters. And messaging can have a massive impact on product onboarding and activation, but you can't just say it, right? Using words isn't enough. What you say has to be matched with what you show. So, messaging, particularly as it relates to product activation, product engagement, and retention, you can't only tell, you have to also show. So, there is absolutely a relationship here. Obviously, this becomes very obvious when somebody has a product marketing title. It is their job to marry these two things together. But if you don't have an in-house product marketing function, then sometimes there can be a disconnect in messaging between those two. So I just wanted to call that out as well as a potential issue. Following on in the potential issues and pitfalls category, obviously one of the things that I think is the biggest culprit of poor messaging is teams guessing instead of actually talking to customers. And this is going to sound really, really obvious coming from us. We do a lot of talking to customers and leveraging what customers know about you and like pulling out of their heads and leveraging that knowledge to make better decisions. And that's no different when it comes to messaging, obviously. So, too many teams are guessing, and it actually takes a lot longer to guess and hypothesize about what your best messaging is going to be, and then putting that messaging out into the market, and then waiting for the data to come in to tell you whether or not it's working. That is a way, way longer process. That takes much, much more time than it would for you to just go to customers, talk to a set of like even 10 to 12 of them. And I'll talk about the process a little bit, but talking to 10 customers takes less time than it would for you to run all those experiments and guess. Or worse, look at what your competitors are doing. You don't know that your competitors know what the hell they're doing. You don't know that they've done any research. You don't know that their messaging is working any better than yours. Even if you're just leveraging it to contrast what your competitors are saying, still, that still might be actually, that is still straight up guessing. And just messaging that is developed in a vacuum, right? Where the team just decides to, hire a really smart copywriter and take a guess at it. That is all guessing. And if you're super early stage, you might be able to get away with that because you have to get something to market to help validate. But if you have any customers at all to learn from, you are wasting time by not talking to your customers. The other pitfall and thing that I see teams do that prevent them from having really resonant and high converting and really effective messaging is they have no high level messaging guide to serve sort of as a source of truth, right? So this messaging guide needs to represent your positioning, but it needs to, especially when we're talking about messaging, is the articulation of that positioning. It needs to be rooted in the audience for that messaging. So a positioning exercise or positioning work that could turn into multiple messaging guides. In fact, it usually will. So the messaging guide and not having a centralized messaging guide is related to positioning in that way. But really why it's a big challenge to not have that centralized messaging guide is because your teams will head off in different directions. And I probably don't need to talk too much about that. You may have experienced that. If you don't have a centralized messaging guide where like nothing is quite hitting, everything kind of feels like spaghetti against the wall. So again, a high level messaging guide to serve as a source of truth and to sort of stay rooted in that customer is really, really important. And it is definitely something that I see a lot of teams fail at, partially because the positioning hasn't been solidified or greenlit. And so everybody's sort of waiting in limbo, or because the positioning has been nailed down, but nobody has really taken it and articulated it inside of a messaging guide. So high level messaging guides are often missing. So the really important thing to remember when it comes to a messaging guide is it needs to be rooted, like I said, in the customers that it is being written for, right? And also related back to positioning, what those customers are comparing you to, the key attributes and the value that those key attributes provide, right? All of those things have to be articulated inside the messaging guide. And now the other thing that I will say is that, and this is sort of a follow on to that, is A lot of teams don't adapt their messaging for the different stages of the customer journey. They don't adapt their messaging for the different profiles of the people who show up in that journey. And last, but definitely not least, in fact, I would start here. A lot of times, there is no messaging rooted in the customer's job to be done. So, what problem they're trying to solve versus the benefits of your solution. There's been lots of material on this. I'm not saying that you shouldn't be focused on benefits. This isn't a features versus benefits discussion here, but really like what is the problem? What is the pain that your customer is experiencing? What is the job your customer is hiring you to do for them versus messaging that tends to be rooted in well, just like features all over the place, again, not rooted in the problem that you help customers solve. So again, assuming it's a messaging a marketing problem, big red flag. The other thing is not actually doing the research and just guessing and wasting time in experimentation mode. The other one is not having a high level messaging guide and really rooting it in like who you're articulating your positioning for in that messaging guide. And then the other one that I actually think is the biggest opportunity is a messaging guide that isn't actually rooted in like the follow-on messaging strategy that isn't rooted in the stage of the customer experience, the different profiles of people who show up, and the jobs to be done of those profiles of people who show up. And then lastly, depending on who they are and where they're consuming. So a lot of companies don't do this, right? They've got a high-level messaging guide, maybe. They often don't, but maybe. And that is sort of the source of truth and the messaging that the team takes to market in the marketing campaigns doesn't take into account the levels of awareness, right? Are you selling to a problem aware, a solution aware, or a product aware audience? The website itself, same thing, right? Is it a problem aware or problem unaware in category creation spaces and things like that? Solution aware. So levels of awareness on the website are really important. Same messaging might be used in sales, as in onboarding, as in customer education and expansion. Oh my gosh, I hope not. But using the same messaging across all of those different contexts is really just sloppy. It's just sloppy marketing. So, okay, let's talk about how to find the right messaging. And then I'm going to talk about the process of like actually turning that messaging into your moat. So, it is not going to surprise you to hear that one of the roots, one of the most fundamental things that you have to get right when developing the right messaging for you and the messaging that you can turn into a moat is knowing what customers are comparing you to and knowing what actually convinces your customers to buy. So, talking about competition, we like to think about competition in through sort of like three lenses, right? Solutions that your customers are firing in order to hire yours. This is particularly important in a PLG motion where it is your functional user landing on your website and thinking about you through the lens of the problem that they're trying to solve versus maybe in a more sales led or like a different context where alternative solutions might come into play. So, fired solutions or solutions that your customer is moving away from is one way to think about like the types of competition that you need to position yourself against. Then there's also like alternative solutions, right? That might be like, fuck it, I don't need more software. I'm just going to like hire somebody to solve this problem or leveraging existing tools and not purchasing anything at all. Just other ways of solving your problem that isn't continuing with the old way and that isn't the next one, which is like direct and indirect competitors. I'm not going to get into the details of that necessarily, but what is important to know about direct and indirect competitors is that it's very, very likely that your team and the different teams at your company think about competition very, very differently. And it isn't always in a very helpful way, particularly when it comes to messaging. So, marketing, for example, might think about competition as like those that are out in the market, the ones that they see all the time. That doesn't necessarily mean that those competitors are in your customer's mind's eye when they land on your website, for an example. They might be, but they might not be. Another example is customer success and sales. They know a lot about that fired solution, right? What customers are struggling with the old way. They know a lot about the short list of, what might be the alternative solutions or direct competitors that your customers are considering versus the product teams that tend to live a little bit more in the future. They're trying to future proof the business. They're thinking about competitors that customers might not even be aware of yet. And so, when in doubt, and those are only a few examples, right? There's lots of different ways to think about competitors. Like even the leadership team might be, closer to where the product team is typically. But at the end of the day, the most helpful way to think about your competition and who you position yourself against is through the lens of customers and the audience, particularly when it comes to your messaging. I'm not talking about, necessarily all your competitors you need to position against overall, like in the entirety. I'm talking specifically about when it comes to your messaging and the articulation of your messaging in certain context. Some competing solutions are going to be more relevant than others. And, the articulation of your messaging is really about what you do today. It's for helping articulate why somebody would want to choose you over any of the other competing solutions today, not in 6 months from now. We always ask the teams that we work with, what are your top three competitors? Like, who would you say are your top three competitors or competing solutions? And 8 out of 10 times, the research never reflects back what the team said. Like sometimes there's some others, particularly in a sales led, motion. Some of the competitors will show up, but by and large, those competitors don't even show up in those customer conversations. And we're literally digging for like, what would have prevented you? What other solutions did you explore? Very, very often, again, about 8 times out of 10, those competing solutions don't even show up. But again, context is everything. The other thing that you need to get very clear on before you can leverage messaging as a moat would be really, really understanding what your customers actually care about. We talk about this a lot, but what I'm talking about specifically is like the key attributes of your solution that drive value and that drive somebody to actually make a decision. And this is where we get into the like avoid the inside the jar kind of thinking, right? We want to understand what's motivating our customer, what are the pushes and pulls basically in that decision making? What are their aha moments? The answers to what was it that convinced you to choose us over all of the other solutions? So that's really what we're getting to when we get to the heart of like, what do customers actually say matters to them? It is often, I'd say 9 times out of 10, it is different than what the team thinks. We have a lot of eureka moments with the companies that we work with and the teams that we work with when it comes to like what actually matters to customers. So we talk about this a lot, but understanding this, understanding how to sort of narrow your scope and focus on the things that customers actually really care about versus the stuff you're really excited to talk about, it's a big issue as well. Okay, so let's move into talking about how to make messaging your moat, how to get really strategic with your messaging. So, first and foremost, I am not going to surprise you. Focus on identifying the jobs to be done across your customer base. And there's a lot of reasons for this, but one of the main reasons is that jobs to be done is what helps you sort of cut to the heart of what you should be focused on in your messaging, but also across that documentary of your customer's experience with you, because jobs to be done asks somebody to walk you through that documentary of what their experience was like, what was going on in their world that led them to seek out a solution like yours. What happened, what convinced them to, like I mentioned before, what convinced them to try your solution over all of the others. What can you do now that you weren't able to do before? What are they focused on solving now, right? What's next for them? Now, one of the things that I need to mention here is that identifying your jobs to be done across your customer base is really, really important. So there isn't just one customer job to be done, right? If you look at your entire customer base, and this is particularly true for those that sell into more complex organizations, you will identify basically multiple segments of customers. So it might be like a direct to market customer base, or it might be, brands versus service providers. It might be complex organizations. It might be different types of buyers, right? And you might have segments that are wrapped around your functional user versus your economic buyer versus a technical buyer. Those ways of segmenting your customers are really, really important before you do your jobs to be done research. And that is because, And this all relates to your go-to-market motion, right? So this will change for product-led as it will for sales-led. And so I don't want to oversimplify, but I also don't want to overcomplicate this either. But what I mean by like identify the jobs to be done that show up in your customer base is because especially if you're leveraging a product-led motion for a sales, like for a sales motion, like in product-led sales, there are very likely multiple jobs to be done that you need to be developing messaging for. On the other hand, if you're in a pure PLG motion and you sell into SMB, it's a lot more straightforward. You've got one functional user who is also your economic buyer and also your technical buyer. In that case, you can just look across your customer base and learn from them and the various jobs to be done that will emerge, and you can go to market with all of those. But if you leverage a sales model at all, there's going to be multiple buyers involved. And it's really important for you to identify the jobs to be done through all of those segments. Sorry to say, but it's a little bit more complicated. Anyways, once you identify the segment that you want to prioritize, the teams that we work with, by the way, they prioritize segments based on basically their growth model, their go-to-market motion. And so if, for us, it's those teams that leverage a PLG motion, whether or not it's for sales or not. And so we're focused on who is that person who's actively seeking out the solution that you solve. And so that's where we typically start when we are developing not only positioning, but obviously messaging. So we learn from them. I ask them those questions. What happened that led you to, seek out a solution like ours? What convinced you? What can you do now? What are you focused on next? And then you develop a messaging guide based on that, right? So a guide that captures that. And then once you've got the high level, like job to be done, how they describe what their problem was, all of those things that I just talked through, all of those we do 9 different dimensions. So when we run interviews, we sort of break down the patterns across 9 different dimensions in the voice of customer. So I'm not going to get into the details of that because that's way too in the weeds. But what is really the sort of next step to this is develop that high level messaging guide based on that job to be done, that customer's job to be done. But then where we get really strategic and where messaging actually becomes your moat is when you can develop a messaging strategy for your team that actually touches on each of the phases of your customer experience. So the struggle phase, the evaluation phase, and the growth phase, because your messaging needs to change in each of those contexts, right? It's really, really important. So we talked about jobs to be done, helping give you a understanding of that customer journey, that documentary-like understanding of the customer journey. Well, when you repeat that back to them, when you go to like implement that learning and those insights across your customer experience, you need to articulate that value, and your messaging needs and should change based on the context of where they are in that customer experience. So, for example, in the struggle phase, again, depending on their level of awareness, your marketing campaigns might be focused on the problem or might be focused on the solution, depending on what's most relevant for your audience. Are they problem unaware? Are they problem aware? Are they solution aware? The messaging that you lean into back to like the problem that you help them solve and that job to be done is going to change. Imagine I'm just talking about messaging out in the market. Now compare that to your website. Well, the messaging strategy on your website is not going to just be a carbon copy of what you say out in the market to drum up awareness about your solution. No, now your website has a completely different job. And so the messaging on your website, it might be focused on those who are solution aware or product aware. Sometimes it depends on the marketing that is happening. So we worked with a team not that long ago where their messaging would actually need to change from depending on what time of the year it was, because they had such a seasonal business, or their customers, I'm sorry, had such seasonal businesses that at some part of the year, most of their traffic was organic. And so people would show up with some level of product awareness versus other times of year, their marketing was largely led by events and like in-person type of efforts. And so people landing on their website at that time of year are a lot less solution aware. They're only problem aware. So the messaging on the website is really, really critical and can often differ wildly from the messaging on, out in the market, like I said. And then if obviously there's a lot more to say there. I'm skimming over the top here, but then think about evaluation, right? So your messaging during the evaluation phase is also very, very different. So the aha moment that you're trying to lead customers to, the value that you're trying to help them get to and articulate how you're sort of teasing the problem that they're solving, the fact that they're still struggling with the old way. And now your job is to help reinforce how painful the old way is, how much better and meaningful this solution is going to be for them, directly correlate those two things together, help them get to those moments of value and connect the dots between the problem that they're solving, the old way, and this new solution. So there's a lot of dot connecting in onboarding, obviously, but the job is really to convince them that like you deeply understand the problem that they have and that your solution is perfect for them. And then during the evaluation phase, particularly, after activation and we're getting more into like engagement, happy, healthy customers, then our job becomes a little bit more about, if we can identify customers who are at risk. This is really interesting, right? Like if you see a customer that doesn't activate or that becomes like unengaged with the product, well, then your messaging needs to focus on reminding them of the struggle. It's not as much product focused anymore. It's back to a little bit more problem focused. So you can see how just across the struggle phase and the evaluation phase, the messaging strategy along the way differs wildly. Context is everything. And you can't just leave this stuff to chance anymore. Then there's the growth phase, which I didn't talk about yet. We don't often get to talk about the growth phase, even though it's super interesting. But the growth phase is really about ongoing engagement and health of your customers and customer education and helping them feel supported. And so understanding, now that they have this solution in their life, how do they articulate that? What does it allow them to do? How does that change in a B2B, especially environment? How does that change how they're working with across their team, other solutions? How does your solution interact with other tools? The growth opportunities, there's all kinds of things that you may want to talk about in the growth phase. Again, completely different articulation of your messaging. So hopefully what you're picking up here from what I'm putting down is that not only do you need a high level messaging that articulates that high level customer job to be done, why they should compare, why they should choose you over all the other solutions, how they're comparing you to other products and other solutions, whether or not it's direct competitors, the old way, alternative solutions, also what really, really matters to them. Again, high level messaging guide. The way to really turn this into a moat for your business is to have a messaging strategy at every major milestone and leap of faith in your customer's relationship with you, and being really, really strategic and thoughtful about the context in which you are providing that messaging. So again, that is what would put you ahead of about 95% of your competition. I would wager the number's probably even higher than that. Again, I'm probably repeating myself. I sound like a broken record, but like it's 2025. There is no reason why tech companies cannot leverage messaging in this way. You absolutely have this opportunity, even if you do it in a completely unscalable way. Even if you literally have team members tracking customers at the milestones that they're at and delivering this messaging manually if you have to, do it. This is what is going to make all the difference. You're going to basically plug all the holes in your leaky bucket, let alone being way more resident on the front end of your customer experience. But like I said, win backs and re-engagements all throughout the way, and making sure that your messaging really ties back to what they care about at the right moment. So right message at the right time for the right person is really at the core of this. And I would start with like the right person, right? The right job to be done. And then you do all these other things with it. So, okay, I want to recap.